My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 46, and I've spent the last 14 years as a human resources director, the kind of career where I've sat across from hundreds of employees, delivering the hardest conversations a workplace can require. Terminations, restructurings, the specific, careful language you use when you have to tell someone something true that they don't want to hear. I know how to read a room the moment something has shifted underneath the surface of it. How to notice the exact second someone stops looking you in the eye, because they already know what they've done. I did not expect to need that particular instinct on an ordinary Tuesday evening, sitting alone on my couch with a cup of tea going cold beside me, scrolling through Instagram the way I did most nights before bed, and finding 3 photos into my daughter's public profile, professional wedding photography of my only child in a white dress I had never seen, surrounded by smiling faces I mostly didn't recognize, at an event that had clearly already happened. I sat very still, the phone screen glowing in the dim living room, and felt something in my chest go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with calm. I scrolled slowly through the album, 43 photos in total, counting them the way I count anything when I need my hands to have a task, while the rest of me processes something too large to hold all at once. My daughter, Sophia, laughing under string lights. Sophia dancing with a man I recognized as Ryan, her boyfriend of 2 years, now apparently her husband. Sophia's father, Daniel, in a suit, his arm around her shoulders in a photograph clearly staged for exactly this kind of public sharing. I was not in a single one of them. I had not been invited to a single minute of it. If you've ever discovered something that shattered your entire understanding of a relationship through a stranger's screen, scrolling alone at night with no one to tell, I need you to stay with me, because this story does not end where my daughter expected it to. I want to explain what those 43 photographs actually meant underneath the shock of finding them, because I don't think the moment lands with its real weight without the 24 years of context sitting beneath it. I raised Sophia largely on my own after my divorce from Daniel when she was 6, the kind of quiet, unglamorous single parenthood that doesn't make for dramatic stories so much as a decade and a half of small, constant sacrifices nobody ever really notices while they're happening. I worked 2 jobs for the first 3 years after the divorce, one in HR during the day, and a second doing administrative work 3 evenings a week, so Sophia could stay in the same school district with the same friends, instead of uprooting her life on top of everything else that had already changed. I skipped vacations. I drove a car with over 200,000 miles on it, well past the point most people would have replaced it, so that Sophia could have braces, a laptop for school, the specific small comforts I wanted her childhood to include, even when mine, during those years, didn't include much of anything beyond work and worry. Daniel, for his part, had drifted in and out of Sophia's life with the particular inconsistency of a parent who enjoyed the good parts of fatherhood without ever quite committing to the difficult, daily labor of it. He remarried within 2 years, built a comfortable life in commercial real estate, and became, over time, the parent who showed up for the fun milestones, the graduation parties, the celebratory dinners, while I remained the parent who showed up for everything else, the fevers at 2 a.m., the school project deadlines, the quiet, unglamorous infrastructure of an entire childhood. I hadn't minded, not really, not for years. I told myself that's simply what love looks like sometimes, invisible, unglamorous, never quite as celebrated as it deserves to be. I didn't understand, sitting on my couch that Tuesday night, looking at photographs of a wedding I hadn't been told about, exactly how much that quiet invisibility had apparently cost me in my daughter's eyes. If you've ever given the unglamorous, invisible kind of love for years, only to watch someone else get credit for the fun, visible parts, comment, "I know that invisibility," below. This story is for you. I didn't call Sophia that night. I sat with the photographs for a long time instead, the same careful, methodical stillness I bring to any difficult workplace conversation before I actually have it, giving myself time to understand exactly what I was feeling before I said anything I couldn't take back. I thought about the last time I'd actually spoken with her, 6 weeks earlier. A brief phone call about nothing in particular, her voice carrying the same easy, distracted warmth it usually did during our increasingly infrequent conversations. She hadn't mentioned an engagement. She hadn't mentioned a wedding date. I understood, scrolling back through the album's caption, "The best day of our lives, surrounded by everyone who matters," that whatever had happened between that phone call and this wedding had been planned, deliberately, entirely, without me. I finally called her the next evening, after a full day of forcing myself through ordinary work meetings with my mind circling the same unanswered question. She picked up on the third ring, her voice bright and unbothered in a way that told me immediately she hadn't spent the previous 24 hours anticipating this conversation the way I had. "Mom, hey, what's up?" "I saw the wedding photos," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "On Instagram." There was a pause, brief but unmistakable, the specific silence of someone recalibrating in real time. "Oh," she said. "Yeah, we ended up keeping it really small. Just close friends, honestly. It wasn't a big planned thing, it kind of just happened." 43 professionally photographed images did not sound, to me, like something that had just happened. I didn't say that out loud. I said something quieter instead, something that cost me more to say calmly than almost anything I'd said in years. "I would have liked to have been there, Sophia." "I know," she said, in a tone that suggested she considered the matter closed rather than opened. "It just got complicated with Ryan's family stuff. I didn't want to make it a whole thing." If you've ever had someone reduce your absence from the most important day of their life to complicated, without ever actually explaining what that complication was, comment, "That's not an answer," below. We're only getting started. I didn't push further that night. I want to be honest about why, the same honesty I'd want from anyone telling me this account. Some part of me was still hoping, even holding the phone with her deflection ringing in my ears, that there was a version of this where the explanation would eventually arrive, where Sophia would call back in a few days with the fuller, more honest account I sensed was still missing. I spent the following weeks in the specific, quiet grief of a mother processing a loss that nobody around her fully understood, because how do you explain to a coworker or a friend that you're grieving a wedding, an entire day, that happened without you while your daughter is still, technically, alive and well, and simply choosing not to include you in her life the way you'd always assumed she would? I went to work. I ran my usual meetings, delivered my usual careful, professional conversations to employees navigating their own difficult transitions, and came home each evening to a quiet apartment that felt, for the first time in years, genuinely empty rather than simply peaceful. Grace Holloway, a family friend who also happened to work as a wedding planner in the same city, reached out to me almost by accident, mentioning during a casual coffee that she'd heard through the industry's small, interconnected grapevine some details about Sophia's wedding that Sophia herself hadn't shared with me. "It wasn't actually small," Grace told me carefully, watching my face as she said it. "I heard it ran close to 60 guests, a full sit-down dinner, a band. It was planned for months, Evelyn. I don't think it just happened is really what occurred here." I sat with that information the way I sit with any uncomfortable truth in my professional life, quietly, methodically, letting it settle into place rather than reacting immediately. My daughter hadn't simply kept things small to avoid drama. She had planned, deliberately, an entire wedding designed specifically to exclude me, and had then offered me an explanation she must have known wasn't true. If you've ever discovered that the small, gentle lie someone told you to soften, a rejection was actually covering something far more deliberate, comment, "The lie was the real wound," below. Chapter 2 is where I start understanding exactly how long this had actually been building. 3 weeks after that phone call, on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday evening, my phone rang with Sophia's name on the screen, and for one brief, foolish second, hope moved through me faster than I could stop it. The hope that this was finally the call where she explained everything honestly, where some genuine apology might exist on the other end of the line. "Hey, Mom," she said, her voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in months, and I let myself believe, for just a moment, that warmth meant what it used to mean. "So, Ryan and I are planning our honeymoon finally, now that things have settled down. We're thinking Dubai. It's going to be incredible. But his parents backed out of covering it, like they originally said they would, and things are just really tight for us right now, with the wedding expenses. I was hoping you might be able to help us out, just this once." I sat very still, the phone against my ear, my apartment quiet around me, and felt the specific, cold clarity settle over me that I recognize from every difficult workplace conversation where someone finally reveals what they actually wanted from the beginning. Not an apology, not an explanation for the wedding. Money for a honeymoon celebrating a marriage I hadn't been invited to witness. If you've ever picked up the phone hoping for an apology and received a request for money instead, comment, "I know that whiplash," below. Chapter 2 is where I finally start understanding exactly what I've actually been to this family for longer than I wanted to admit. I told Sophia I needed a few days to think about the honeymoon request, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, given how unsteady I felt underneath it. She sounded faintly annoyed by the delay, the specific breezy irritation of someone who had expected an immediate yes, but she said fine, take your time, and hung up quickly enough that I understood the call had never really been about reconnecting with me at all. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the same table where I'd helped Sophia with homework for 12 straight years, algebra and essays and a science fair volcano that had taken us an entire Saturday to build together, and I pulled out an old shoebox I kept in my closet, the kind of box every parent seems to accumulate without meaning to. School photos, report cards, a construction paper card from second grade that read, "I love you, Mommy," in careful, uneven crayon letters. I don't know exactly what I was looking for that night, sitting there with the box open in front of me, the specific musty smell of old paper and faded photographs filling the quiet kitchen. I think some part of me needed physical proof that the relationship I remembered had actually existed, that I hadn't imagined an entire childhood of closeness that had somehow, gradually, been replaced by whatever version of our relationship existed now. If you've ever gone looking through old keepsakes for proof that a relationship you remember was actually real, comment "I know that" search below. This is where I started understanding exactly what had changed. I began, over the following days, doing something I hadn't let myself do in years, actually tracing, deliberately and honestly, the shape of my relationship with Sophia across her adult life, rather than simply accepting each small distance as it arrived without examining the pattern underneath it. I pulled up old bank statements, not out of any specific suspicion yet, just the same instinct that makes me review any situation methodically before I react to it emotionally. What I found, going back nearly 6 years, was a pattern I hadn't let myself see clearly while I was living inside it. A security deposit for Sophia's first apartment after college, covered entirely by me. A car repair the year she was between jobs, $400 I'd sent without hesitation. Tuition for a marketing certification program she'd wanted to add to her resume, $2,000 I'd transferred without a second thought. A loan toward her and Ryan's engagement ring fund, $800 I'd never once brought up again, not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd never wanted money to feel like the defining feature of our relationship. I added it up that evening, sitting at the same kitchen table, a specific kind of quiet arithmetic I do for a living in an entirely different context, and the total surprised me, even though every individual piece hadn't, at the time, felt like very much at all. Nearly $9,000 across 6 years, given freely, without complaint, without ever once being acknowledged as anything more than what a mother was simply supposed to provide. If you've ever added up years of quiet, individually small sacrifices and been startled by what the total actually was, comment "The math surprised me too" below. We're just getting started. Grace called me again that week, this time with more specific details about the wedding itself, the kind of information that arrives slowly through a small industry's grapevine once someone starts quietly asking the right questions. "I found out who did the flowers," she told me over coffee, her voice careful, the particular gentleness of someone delivering information she suspects will hurt before it helps. "Same florist I've used for 3 of my own weddings this year." She mentioned the whole event ran close to $40,000, mostly covered by Ryan's family, with some contribution from Daniel. I sat with my coffee going cold in front of me, the specific smell of the cafe's espresso machine and fresh pastries doing nothing to soften the information settling into place. Daniel, who had shown up for exactly the fun, visible parts of Sophia's life for 24 years, had apparently been invited to help fund the wedding. I, who had built the entire invisible infrastructure of her childhood, had not even been told it was happening. "Did anyone say why I wasn't there?" I asked, and I heard my own voice come out smaller than I wanted it to. Grace hesitated, the specific pause of someone deciding how much honesty a friend can actually absorb in one sitting. "The florist mentioned something about Sophia not wanting complications with the seating arrangements," she said carefully. "I think that might have been about you and Daniel being in the same room." "I don't think it was really about you at all, Evelyn. I think it was about her wanting an easy day, and deciding your feelings were the thing that could be sacrificed to get it." If you've ever discovered that your own exclusion from something important was simply the path of least resistance for someone else's comfort, comment "I was the easy thing to cut" below. Here's the arithmetic I want you to sit with for a second, because I sat with it for the better part of 2 weeks. I had spent 24 years building the entire invisible architecture of my daughter's life, the fevers at 2 a.m., the school project deadlines, 2 jobs held simultaneously so she never had to feel the full weight of our reduced circumstances after the divorce, the quiet, unglamorous sacrifices that don't photograph well and don't make good stories at dinner parties. I had never asked her to acknowledge any of it. I had understood, or told myself I understood, that this was simply what unconditional love looked like, invisible and constant, never requiring credit to remain genuine. And when it came time to plan the single, most significant celebration of her adult life, I had been quietly, deliberately excluded, not out of any specific conflict or crisis, but because my presence represented a complication easier to remove than to navigate. Meanwhile, the parent who had shown up for the easy, photogenic milestones, who had built a comfortable, distant relationship requiring none of the daily labor I'd provided, had been welcomed without hesitation. I thought about every birthday I'd made, memorable on a limited budget, every holiday I'd made feel abundant despite counting every dollar behind the scenes, every moment I'd quietly absorbed the cost of her comfort so she'd never have to think about money the way I'd been forced to think about it constantly. I understood, sitting with this arithmetic laid bare in front of me, that somewhere along the way, my daughter had learned to see me as a resource to draw from rather than a person to include. If you've ever done the math on everything you gave, invisibly, for years, and realized the person receiving it had quietly stopped seeing you as anything but a resource, comment "The invisible labor finally added up" below. Chapter 3 is where I stop just gathering evidence and start deciding exactly what I'm going to do with what I now understand. I met with an old friend from graduate school, Deborah, a family therapist I'd known for over a decade, not for formal counseling exactly, but for the kind of honest conversation only someone with both professional insight and genuine history can offer. We sat in her small, quiet office after hours, the smell of her chamomile tea filling the space, and I told her everything. The wedding, the honeymoon request, the 6 years of quiet financial contributions I'd never once questioned until now. What you're describing, Deborah said carefully, is a pattern I see fairly often in families where one parent provided the consistent, unglamorous care and the other provided the intermittent, celebratory presence. Children sometimes internalize an unconscious hierarchy from that dynamic. The parent who's always there becomes background, expected, almost invisible, while the parent who shows up occasionally gets treated as a treat, something to be grateful for. It's not fair, and it's not really Sophia's fault entirely, but it also doesn't mean you have to keep accepting the role she's assigned you. I thought about that conversation for days afterward, turning it over the way I turn over any difficult professional assessment before deciding how to act on it. I didn't want to believe my own daughter saw me as merely background infrastructure in her life, useful but not actually valued the way a person is valued. But sitting with the evidence I'd gathered, the bank statements, Grace's careful account of the wedding's real scale, the honeymoon request that had arrived within weeks of my exclusion, rather than any apology, I understood I couldn't keep explaining away what the pattern so clearly showed. If you've ever had a professional friend finally give you the language for a pattern you'd been living inside for years without being able to name it, comment, "That's exactly it," below. Chapter 3 is where I finally decide what I'm going to say when Sophia calls back, expecting an answer. I didn't respond to Sophia's request right away, letting the days I'd asked for stretch a little longer than I'd originally suggested, not out of any strategic delay, but because I genuinely needed the time to understand what I actually wanted to say, and more importantly, what I needed to finally stop saying to myself about the shape of this relationship. I pulled together over those final days before I called her back, a kind of private accounting I'd never once assembled before. Not for her benefit, not as ammunition for an argument, but simply because I needed, for my own clarity, to see the full shape of what I'd given across 24 years laid out honestly in one place. The tuition contributions, the apartment deposit, the quiet years of 2 jobs so she'd never feel what we'd actually lost in the divorce. Every school event I'd attended alone, while Daniel occasionally appeared for the ones with photographers. Every holiday I'd made feel abundant, while carefully managing a budget she never once had to think about. By the time I finally called her back, I had something I hadn't had 3 weeks earlier, sitting alone on my couch, discovering 43 wedding photographs I'd never been invited to witness. I had clarity. Not anger exactly, though there was some of that too, but something steadier underneath it. The specific, quiet understanding of a woman who finally recognized the actual shape of her own worth, independent of whether her daughter had ever bothered to see it clearly. If you've ever spent weeks quietly gathering the evidence of your own value, specifically so you could finally stop doubting it yourself, comment, "I found my own proof," below. Chapter 3 is where I finally say everything I've been holding back for years. I called Sophia back on a Sunday afternoon, exactly 9 days after her honeymoon request, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, the accumulated clarity of the previous 2 weeks settling into something I could actually stand on. She answered on the second ring, her tone immediately bright and expectant in a way that told me she assumed this call carried good news. "Hey, so, did you think about Dubai?" she asked. No preamble, no acknowledgement of the weeks of silence that had passed since I'd last heard her voice. "I did," I said, keeping my tone level, the same measured register I use delivering a difficult message in any professional context. Before I answer, I want to ask you something. Why wasn't I at your wedding, Sophia? The real reason, not the version about keeping things small. There was a pause, and I could hear, faintly, the sound of a television in the background, The ordinary noise of an ordinary Sunday she was living without any sense that this conversation might unfold differently than she expected. "Mom, we already talked about this. It just felt easier without the whole seating chart thing with you and Dad." "Easier for who?" I asked. If you've ever asked someone to finally give you the honest version of an explanation they'd already tried to soften once, comment, "I asked for the truth," below. This is the moment everything started to shift for me. I want to tell you about the exact moment the arithmetic finished, because it wasn't the Instagram photos, and it wasn't Grace's careful account of the wedding's real cost. It was that Sunday afternoon phone call, sitting alone in my kitchen with the shoebox of old photographs still on the table where I'd left it 2 weeks earlier, doing the kind of comparison I'd been circling without quite letting myself land on it fully. I made 2 columns on a legal pad, the same instinct that serves me every day, evaluating a workplace conflict taking over almost against my will. On one side, I wrote down every dollar and every hour I had given Sophia across 24 years, 2 jobs during her childhood, $9,000 in adult financial support I'd never once mentioned again after giving it, every school event attended alone, every holiday made to feel abundant on a budget she never had to think about. On the other side, I wrote down every moment she had shown up for me the way a daughter shows up for a parent, unconditionally, without it being tied to something she needed from me first. The first column filled most of a page, the entries stretching back further the longer I sat with it. The second column had 2 entries. A Mother's Day card 3 years ago, store-bought, signed simply "Love, Sophia." No note beyond the printed sentiment already inside it. A single visit to my apartment the year I had minor surgery, 40 minutes long, most of it spent on her phone. I stared at those 2 columns for a long time, my kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled sound of her television still audible faintly through the phone I'd set down on the table. And somewhere in that stillness, I stopped waiting for the second column to grow. If you've ever made that list, what you gave against what you got, and felt the floor drop out from under you when you saw the gap in your own handwriting, I need you to know you're not the only one. Keep reading. It gets better from here. I stopped looking for validation somewhere in that silence, and I started calculating instead. And the shift between those 2 states felt less like a decision and more like something physical. A held breath finally released. Validation had always required Sophia to see my sacrifices as meaningful. Calculation only required me to finally see myself clearly, and to see her clearly too, without the soft, generous interpretation I'd apparently been applying to every one of her choices for years. I thought about every year I'd told myself the growing distance between us was simply what happens naturally as children become adults, that busy young professionals sometimes drift from their parents temporarily before eventually circling back with gratitude once they understood, firsthand, how much their own parents had given them. I had built an entire, patient explanation for her behavior out of nothing but hope, filling in the gaps myself the way you fill in a redacted document, assuming some reasonable version of love existed behind the distance, because the alternative felt too large to hold. I understood now, sitting there with my 2 unequal columns and my daughter's cheerful, oblivious voice still faintly audible from the phone on the table, that I had spent 24 years being useful to Sophia in exactly one specific way. As a reliable, unconditional source of support, she never had to actually maintain a relationship to access. Nobody thanks the infrastructure. Nobody invites it to the wedding. They just call it, when convenient, needing a honeymoon funded, confident it will answer. If you've ever realized you were being treated as infrastructure instead of being loved as an actual person, tell me. I think this is one of the loneliest realizations a parent can have, and I don't think enough people say it out loud. I picked the phone back up, my hand steady in a way that surprised me. The absence of the low, constant hum of hurt I'd been carrying since the Instagram photos, replaced by something with better posture. something I didn't fully recognize yet, though I would come to know it very well by the time this conversation ended. "Sophia," I said, "I'm not going to pay for your honeymoon." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "Wait, seriously? Mom, it's not that much money for you. I don't understand why you're being like this." "I'm not being like anything," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm telling you clearly, for the first time in longer than I can remember, exactly what I actually think. You didn't invite me to your wedding. You gave me an explanation you and I both know wasn't true. And 3 weeks later, the first time you reached out, it wasn't to apologize or to try to understand how that decision affected me. It was to ask for money." "That's not fair," Sophia said, her voice sharpening now, the specific defensive edge I recognized from every difficult conversation I've ever mediated at work when someone finally has to hear something they'd rather not. "You're twisting this into something bigger than it is." "I don't think I am," I said. "I think, for the first time, I'm finally seeing it clearly. If you've ever finally said the true thing out loud, after years of softening it for someone else's comfort, comment 'I said it plainly' below." "You've always helped before," Sophia said, and I heard, underneath the frustration in her voice, something closer to genuine confusion, as though she truly didn't understand why this particular request had landed differently than every other one before it. "The apartment deposit, my certification program, the ring fund. Why is this different?" "Because every other time," I said, "I gave because I loved you, not because I expected anything in return. I never once brought any of it up again after I gave it. But I think somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing that as love, Sophia. I think you started seeing it as something you were simply owed, something that didn't require you to actually maintain a relationship with me in order to keep receiving it." She didn't answer right away, and in that silence, I found myself continuing, the words arriving with a clarity I hadn't planned, but somehow already fully understood. "I worked 2 jobs for 3 years, so you never had to feel what we lost in the divorce. I sat alone at more school events than I can count, while your father showed up for the ones with cameras. I never once asked you to acknowledge any of that, because I believed love shouldn't require a scoreboard. But I also never imagined it would end with you planning an entire wedding specifically designed to leave me out, and then calling me 3 weeks later, needing money for a honeymoon." "So what? You're punishing me now?" she said. And I heard the specific brittleness in her voice of someone unused to being told no by the one person who had never told her no before. "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm simply done pretending that what's happened between us these last few years is fine. I love you. I will always love you. But I'm not going to keep funding a relationship that only calls on me when it needs something. If you've ever finally drawn a boundary with someone who had never once expected you to have one, comment 'I drew the line' below." Chapter 4 is where she finally has to sit with what that boundary actually means. I hung up the phone that evening after a conversation that ended, eventually, in frustrated silence on her end rather than any real resolution, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, the shoebox of old photographs still open in front of me, the construction paper card from 2nd grade sitting on top where I'd left it. "I love you, Mommy," in careful, uneven crayon letters, written by a 6-year-old who hadn't yet learned that love could someday become conditional on what I was able to provide. I didn't cry. Not right away. I think people expect a breaking point to look like tears, a woman finally collapsing somewhere quiet. Mine looked like the opposite. My jaw tightened, my shoulders squared, and I sat up straighter at my kitchen table than I had in weeks, the posture of someone finally done accepting a version of her own worth that had never actually been true. I picked up the old photographs one by one, looking at each of them slowly, understanding for the first time in this entire ordeal that the woman in those photos, tired, quietly determined, working 2 jobs and driving a car well past the point most people would have replaced it, deserved more than what her own daughter had given her these last few years. I deserved more than being remembered only when a payment was due. If you've ever looked back through old proof of everything you gave and finally decided you deserved to be loved for more than what you could provide, stay with me. Chapter 4 is where the truth of all of this finally comes fully into the light. I picked up my phone one final time that night and sent Sophia a single message, the words arriving easily after everything I'd already said out loud. I hope one day you understand what I actually gave you. Until then, I need some distance to take care of myself, the way I always took care of you. I set the phone down, the quiet click of it against the table feeling like the final, seismic close of a door that had been slowly swinging shut for years, and I sat there in my kitchen a while longer, feeling something unfamiliar settle into place. Not grief exactly, something steadier than that. Something that felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like the beginning of peace. Sophia didn't call back for 2 weeks after that message, and I let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to, understanding for the first time in years that I didn't have to be the one to fill it. I went to work each day, ran my usual meetings, came home to an apartment that had stopped feeling emptier than usual, and started feeling, instead, like a space that finally belonged fully to me. I even repainted the small guest room that had sat untouched for years, a soft, warm yellow I'd wanted for ages but never gotten around to, the smell of fresh paint filling the apartment for days afterward like a small, private declaration that I intended to keep living here, fully, regardless of how things settled with my daughter. When she did call, it wasn't with the apology I'd once hoped for. It came instead through Grace, who reached out carefully one evening with news she clearly wasn't comfortable delivering, her voice hesitant over the phone in a way I rarely heard from her. "I heard Ryan's parents pulled back on the wedding costs they'd originally agreed to," Grace said. "Apparently, there's been some tension since the wedding, some disagreement about who was actually responsible for what. Sophia's been telling people you refused to help with the honeymoon out of spite." I sat with that for a moment. The specific, quiet sting of hearing your own choice recast as cruelty rather than boundary. The coffee I'd been holding gone lukewarm in my hand. "Out of spite," I repeated. "I told her that wasn't fair," Grace said. "I know what actually happened, Evelyn." I told her gently that maybe it was worth asking why her mother said no before deciding it was about spite. If you've ever set a boundary out of self-respect, only to have it reframed by others as cruelty, comment, "That's not what happened," below. This is where the truth finally starts catching up to everyone. I want to be honest about how those 2 weeks of silence actually felt, because I don't want to make it sound easier than it was. There were evenings I picked up my phone out of old habit, my thumb hovering over her contact photo before I set it back down, the muscle memory of 24 years of being the one who reached out first still strong, even after everything. I let myself feel that pull without acting on it, which was its own kind of practice, the specific discipline of choosing a boundary again and again in the small, unremarkable moments when nobody's watching whether you keep it. I told Deborah about it during our next coffee, admitting how strange it felt to not be the one calling, checking in, smoothing things over the way I'd done my entire adult life with everyone in my orbit. "That's the part people don't expect," she said. "Setting the boundary is hard, but it's often the maintaining of it, quietly day after day, that actually does the work. You're unlearning 24 years of a habit." Give yourself the same patience you'd give anyone else learning something difficult. I want to explain what happened over the following month, because I think it matters to understand that I didn't seek out any of this information. I wasn't building a case against my daughter. I was simply living my life, honestly, for the first time in years. and the truth of what had actually happened arrived on its own, the way truth often does once you stop protecting people from it. Daniel called me, unexpectedly, 3 weeks after Grace's update, his voice carrying an awkwardness I hadn't heard from him in years, the kind of hesitation that told me he'd rehearsed the call at least once before dialing. "I wanted to check in," he said. "Sophia mentioned some tension between you two. I have to say, Evelyn, I was surprised to hear you weren't at the wedding. I assumed there'd been some kind of scheduling conflict. I didn't realize it was intentional." I sat with the specific, quiet irony of my ex-husband, who had shown up for exactly the easy, photographed parts of our daughter's life for 24 years, expressing surprise that I hadn't been included in the hardest, most deliberate exclusion of them all. The phone warm against my ear in the late afternoon light coming through my kitchen window. "She didn't tell you why I wasn't there," I said. "It wasn't really a question." "She said something about avoiding awkwardness with the two of us in the same room," Daniel said. "I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have asked more." "You should have," I said, and I let the silence that followed sit exactly as long as it needed to, not out of cruelty, but because for the first time in years, I didn't feel any particular obligation to fill an uncomfortable pause on someone else's behalf. If you've ever had someone finally start asking the questions they should have asked months earlier, comment "better late than never" below. Here's what I understand now, having had the distance and the time to see the fuller shape of everything that happened. Sophia hadn't excluded me because of any genuine practical concern about seating arrangements or family tension. She had excluded me because somewhere over the previous several years, she had absorbed a quiet, unspoken hierarchy in our family that placed her father's occasional, celebratory presence above my constant, unglamorous one. Not because my love had mattered less, but because it had always been there, reliable enough to take entirely for granted, while his presence, rarer and more sporadic, had somehow come to feel more valuable simply because it required less of her to maintain. I thought about this pattern in the context of my own work, too, the strange parallel I hadn't noticed until I sat with it. In 14 years of HR, I've seen the same dynamic play out in offices constantly. The employee who quietly does the unglamorous, essential work day after day gets passed over for recognition, while the one who shows up occasionally with a flashy, visible contribution gets celebrated for it. Reliability, I've come to understand, has an odd way of making itself invisible, precisely because it never fails. It's only when it finally stops that anyone notices it was ever there at all. I don't say this with bitterness anymore, though I understand if it sounds that way. I say it because I think it's a pattern worth naming honestly, for anyone else who's ever found themselves in the same position. The parent who did the daily, invisible labor of actually raising a child, only to watch that labor eventually reclassified as simply expected. Background: unworthy of the same gratitude as someone else's occasional, easier affection. The honeymoon request, in hindsight, wasn't really about Dubai at all. It was the natural conclusion of a relationship that had quietly, gradually reorganized itself around what I could provide, rather than who I actually was to her. I had let that happen for years, without fully realizing it, because refusing to see it clearly had always felt easier than confronting what the alternative might mean. If you've ever realized that a years-long pattern in your family had been quietly organizing itself around what you could provide, rather than who you actually were, comment "I see the pattern now" below. We're almost at the end of this story. Sophia finally called me directly 2 months after our last real conversation, her voice quieter than I remembered it, none of the bright, expectant energy from the honeymoon request still present in it. I could hear, faintly, the sound of her apartment in the background, none of the busy, cheerful noise that usually accompanied her calls. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me. "About being treated like I only reach out when I need something. I've been talking to Ryan about it, and to a therapist, actually. I didn't love hearing it, but I don't think you were wrong." I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through me. Not quite forgiveness yet, but something adjacent to it. The specific, cautious openness of a woman who has learned, the hard way, not to rush back into old patterns simply because an apology finally arrived. I found myself gripping the phone a little tighter, bracing without quite meaning to, some old instinct still half expecting the conversation to pivot back toward a request rather than an actual reckoning. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "I want you to know I'm not trying to punish you, Sophia. I love you. I will always love you. But I need our relationship to actually be a relationship going forward, not just something you access when it's convenient." "I know," she said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed her. I don't expect things to just go back to how they were. I know I have to actually show up now, not just when I need something. We didn't resolve everything in that single conversation. I want to be honest about that, because I think too many of these stories end with a bow tied too neatly, and ours hasn't, not entirely. We've spoken a handful of times since, careful, tentative conversations that feel like the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding something rather than the easy comfort of something that was never actually broken. If you've ever had someone finally hear you, imperfectly and incompletely, but genuinely, comment, "That's a start," below. Chapter 4's ending is where I finally choose myself. I didn't pay for the honeymoon. Sophia and Ryan ended up postponing the trip, scaling it back considerably once his parents' contribution fell through and my refusal held firm. And I understand, from Grace, that the postponement caused its own strain in their marriage, a strain I take no satisfaction in, though I also no longer feel responsible for absorbing. I spent the months following that final conversation doing something I hadn't done in years, building a life centered around people who actually showed up for me, consistently, without requiring anything in exchange for their presence. I reconnected with old friends I'd let drift during the years I'd poured everything into being endlessly available for Sophia, coffee dates that turned into long, easy afternoons, the specific comfort of being with people who asked about my life and actually waited to hear the answer. I started taking the vacations I'd skipped for over a decade, small trips at first, a long weekend at the coast that I spent mostly reading on a porch with a cup of coffee going cold beside me in a way that finally felt peaceful instead of forgotten. Then longer ones, discovering with something like surprise how much lighter I felt making decisions that considered only my own well-being for the first time in years. I think about that Tuesday evening often, scrolling through Instagram and finding 43 photographs of a wedding I'd never been told about. Not with the raw devastation I felt in that first moment anymore, but with something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds. If I hadn't found those photographs, I don't know how much longer I would have kept, quietly accepting a relationship that had stopped, actually including me, long before I let myself see it clearly. Sophia and I are still finding our way back toward something honest. It's slower than I once hoped it would be, and I've made peace with that slowness, because I understand now that rushing back into old patterns simply to avoid the discomfort of change would have undone everything I finally learned about my own worth. Some evenings, I take the old shoebox down from the closet shelf and look through it again, not with grief this time, but with something steadier. The construction paper card, the crayon letters, proof of a love that existed once and, I believe, still exists somewhere underneath everything that's happened since, waiting for both of us to find our way back to it honestly. Last month, Sophia asked if she could come by on a Sunday afternoon, just to visit. No occasion attached to it, no request waiting underneath the invitation. I said yes, and I spent the morning beforehand almost nervous in a way I hadn't expected, the specific, unfamiliar anxiety of not quite knowing what this new, more honest version of our relationship was actually supposed to look like yet. She arrived with nothing more than a coffee for each of us, and we sat on my balcony for 2 hours talking about nothing important at all. The easy, uncomplicated kind of conversation I hadn't realized, until it was happening, how much I'd missed. It wasn't a resolution, not fully, but it was a beginning, the first one built on something closer to truth than either of us had managed in years, and for now, that feels like enough. If you've ever chosen peace and self-respect over the easy comfort of pretending everything was fine, I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's rare, and it's real, and it's worth everything it costs to get there. Thank you for staying with this story to the end.